Hi everyone, thank you for watching this presentation. This is Beyond the Numbers, using data to create intentional and meaningful learning experiences. I'm Dr. Michael Godinez, and I am one of the assistant principals at St. Patrick High School in Chicago. So first I'll go through a little bit of an introduction to myself, and then we'll get into the presentation. So, like I said, I'm currently assistant principal of data systems and scheduling at St. Patrick. I'm a Loyola alum 2 times, so I went to Loyola from 2011 to 2015 for my undergraduate work, degree in math and in secondary education. I then went to Purdue University for a master's in curriculum and instruction, and then back to Loyola for a doctorate and the principal licensure program through the Greeley Center, the Catholic Principal Prep program. I believe I was cohort 9. And I like to mention that I'm a product of a mostly Catholic education. The only times that I wasn't a student in a Catholic school was preschool and my time at Purdue. So doing work like this, supporting Catholic education and Catholic teachers, is something that's very important to me. I benefited greatly from my time in Catholic schools, so I enjoy making similar benefits possible for today's generation of students. So this presentation, like I said at the beginning, is about using different types of data to set different things up in our educational environments that make things better for our students in whatever way that is possible based on whatever data we're using. So the first thing I wanted to go through is some different types of data, and then we'll talk about some different examples of those types, just because I think when we hear data, a lot of the time we tend to think of like grades or test scores, probably more test scores than anything else. And there are many different kinds of data beyond just that. So the first thing is academic, and that's concerned with students' academic program or progress. And it can be quantitative or qualitative. So certainly numbers and grades and test scores are part of that, but we also have some things that come from either students' perceptions or their family, teacher observations, other things like that. We also have behavioral data. Again, that's usually something like classroom behavior. Do they follow classroom rules and procedures? Do they not? But it can be other things too. It can be their engagement. That is also a form of behavior. Are they paying attention in class or are they not? Um, are they at school? Are they on time to school or to class? Now, some of those things are beyond their control, right? For your younger students, it's really not up to them if they're on time to school because it's their parents driving them. But that is a behavior, and that is something that's important to consider, that data, right? If a student is struggling academically, but you notice they're absent from school a lot, that provides an important piece of context. It is mostly qualitative. And then the last thing is engagement. So it's not student engagement in their classes, but it is things about family engagement. So, how do the families engage with their students, teachers, the school, and so on? Are they engaging with the school? Do they come to things like parent night, parent teacher conference, stuff like that? Or is it more of they drop the student off at 8 and pick them up at 3? And again, this is also mostly qualitative. So some example sources of this data for academic, we talked about grades and test scores. Are the kids getting A's or B's or whatever else? How are they doing on their test scores? Those tests can be, though, classroom. So how are they doing on chapter tests and quizzes that their teachers may make? Things that are adaptive like Star or iReady or IXL or some of those other platforms that adapt to the student, that then maybe are a little more diagnostic in nature. Is this kid at a seventh grade reading level or an eighth grade reading level? Um, It could also be standardized, Terra Nova's, Iowa's, ACT, SAT, things where all students, whether it's paper or electronic, everybody's taking pretty much the same set of questions at the same time, and then they get a score based on how they did. It can also be teacher observations. A teacher may notice that Johnny will get 3-digit multiplication questions correct, but he might struggle with it, might take him longer than 2-digit multiplication. Or another student can do multiplication very quickly, but may struggle with division, even if they, in the end, get the answer correct. It can also be students' perceptions. Students will recognize that, they're better at one thing than another, or they prefer, short stories to novel reading because it's shorter. And then how does the teacher react to that? Okay, Johnny, who likes short stories because they're faster to read, maybe needs to work on some reading endurance. Behavioral, um, different things. Again, what comes to mind first? Conduct referrals, how many, what type, what time of day, those types of things. Number of absences and tardies. But it could also, again, be observations. A teacher or administrator may notice that a particular student may exhibit challenging behavior during certain times of the day or certain transitional activities like coming back from recess. The student can also have some input there as well. A student may say, yeah, I really have a hard time settling down after lunch, and so I get in trouble in math. That's right after lunch. And then engagement, some sources, again, I kind of mentioned this on the previous slide, could be, parental attendance or response to initiatives like open house or curriculum night or whatever it's called, parent-teacher conferences, and so on. Also, parent dialogue with teachers. If teachers are reaching out about something, whether good or bad, do parents respond? How do they respond? Or is it communication is kind of only one way, teacher to family, and then the family maybe doesn't respond. So the first thing, before we talk about some specifics, and I have some examples that we'll go through that you can find in the handout that was linked with this presentation, is how do we set the stage for data integration? How do we set this up in such a way that we can be successful when we're using data to set up this learning environment that we have? So it should be part of what we do all the time. It shouldn't be a once or twice a year. It shouldn't be something kind of haphazard that sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't. It really should be part of how we operate as a school. Whatever your role, communicate at the start of the year how you plan to use and communicate about data with students and families. Now, the ideal time to set up something with data integration is the beginning of the year or the beginning of the term, like the second semester. The second best time is now. So if you have noticed that maybe data integration isn't present or isn't quite where you want it to be, again, best time to do it is start of term because then it just becomes, hey, this is what we're doing going forward. But even if it's in the middle of September and you realize something isn't there, get started as soon as you can. Whenever you do that, though, this communication is important. Um, Parents, students, again, in like age appropriate ways for students, need to know what's going on with data, how you're going to be using it, how they're going to learn about it, how they're going to receive it. Um, the less of a mystery you have around data, the better it's going to go. The more open, the more transparent you are. Planning a yearly cycle of data and what is done at each point before the year begins, more likely that that data is going to be used. So, for example, at our school, we have our standardized testing dates set in early summer for the fall and the spring. We know we're giving the Explore plan in ACT in October on this day and in March on this day, and then we know that we'll get the results back, around this day or that. And then after that, we're going to have a data meeting with departments. We're going to come up with some things to do and so on and so forth. Because that's calendared, at least as well as it can be, right? You can never for sure say if the test is on this date, the results will be available on that date. But it's marked on the calendar. We know what we're doing. We know when we're doing it. Makes it more likely that it'll happen. And then because if you miss something, then it becomes, oh, we were supposed to do this, we didn't get to it, we need to get to it as soon as we can, versus something that may get forgotten. So planning it ahead of time, writing it down, very important to making sure that the data will actually get used when you have it available. Or collect it, right? If you don't, maybe say for like an iReady or STAR testing, if you don't calendar that out, makes it less likely that your teachers will be able to fit it in to the educational program when the year actually gets started. The first thing that you have to do once you kind of have your infrastructure set up is talk with your faculty and staff. So this part is a little bit more geared towards leadership. So the first line of doing this is going to be the leadership. What data sources do we have? Are we purchasing something like an iReady, a STAR test, an ACT? Some of that, if you're part of a diocesan school, may be driven by your diocese or even by a state board of education. Everybody in whatever grade must do this thing or that thing. But once that decision is made, then the second stage is the faculty and staff, your teachers, your counselors, your support teachers. Um, One of the things that needs to happen early and often is a conversation about data. Those staff members should be aware of what data is being collected and how it's going to be used, and then at what points throughout the year that data is going to be reviewed. But it also shouldn't be the be all and end all. Um, Trying to set up a culture where we have, all students must be at 80% proficient on all standards by blah, 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 is not necessarily the most positive environment. Because while it's a great goal, um, solely focusing on data can make things less personal, can make things more focused on whatever is happening on those assessments that generate that data. And that can sometimes take some of the fun and enjoyment away from being at school, which in turn will lead to lower outcomes. The other thing is focusing on just whatever that one thing may be. What maybe it's not data, maybe it's something else, but being hyper focused on anything places a lot of tension and stress around that thing, which again may lead to some lower outcomes. And also, you're going to end up having trouble in other areas if you're only focusing on one because you're not focusing on those areas as well. Leave room whenever you're talking about data. Leave room for teachers to question it. That's perfectly valid because sometimes you'll have something. Let's say it's a test and a kid does really poorly, and their teacher knows that maybe the last time they took that assessment they did really well, or they know that they did well on whatever they were doing in class, and then they took that iReady and it didn't show the same thing. And so questioning that data is important because it can lead you to other things. Same thing with behavior. Maybe there's a student that has never had a behavior issue before and all of a sudden starts having issues in a particular class, or just in general. Maybe they're being disrespectful, talking back to teachers when that never happened in a previous year. And those kind of noticings, those questions can lead to other things that will maybe uncover an issue or solve something for that student. Maybe something's going on at home and that's why they're reacting that way to the teachers, or maybe something happened in the morning on the day they took that test and their mind was elsewhere. They were distracted and they didn't do so well on that one iReady day, and that's why that data point doesn't track with what the teachers know about their kids. And that's important because if there's no room to question it, then you might miss an issue. You're going to be trying to solve, say, an academic problem with more intervention when it was really just an off day, or solve a behavior problem with more consequences when maybe that student just needed to talk to somebody. That being said, you want to reinforce that data will drive decision making, and that vibes aren't a good measure to make educational decisions on. What do I mean by that? It really should be, again, while questions are valid and we should examine those, if we're noticing trends, if the data is showing us that a number of students are missing a particular academic concept, um, the vibe that seems like the kids get it in class, while that may be true, is not being seen in the data. So that may mean they understand the concept in one way, but it's being tested in another, or maybe they understand it at a certain level of rigor, but the test is expecting a higher level, and so that conversation needs to happen based on the data. In general, basing a school or department or grade or whatever unit of schooling you're working with, um, culture on continuous growth is the single best way to build a positive culture around data, because then that data becomes a source to you and to your team of what do we need to look at, what do we need to improve on, where are we doing well that we should celebrate, that we can bring back to our students and our families and say, hey, you did a really good job on this, but we need to look at some other ways to improve on these things. If that's the culture, if we're always trying to improve and making plans to improve, it's going to be easier to bring data into that, because it just becomes one more source of information about, like I said, what you're doing well and where those improvement areas are. So if you look at the handout, and I'm going to project some things, other things are not able to be displayed just because either it wouldn't fit on the slide, or it's not in the handout, and I'll just talk about it because it would contain student information, so you can't have like a generalized thing for a presentation like this. So all of this is based on STAR testing because that's what we use at St. Patrick. There are other things like with the iReady or whatever tool you may be using that should be similar to these that you can use in your own contexts. So this image is the top page of what's called a screening report. So the first thing is, what does the chart tell you? So how would it be used by a grade level team? Discussion points for the team members, and things to manage on the team as you're having that discussion. So the first thing, what does this chart tell you? So you can see this is for reading, and you can see some scores there, a scaled score. You can also see the green, blue, yellow, red, and a dotted line saying benchmark. So the first thing would be, what are these colors? So the green is at or above benchmark. Blue is on watch, which means they missed the benchmark, but not by a lot. So that's probably something to keep an eye on. May have just been an off day. They may have been one question or two off from the benchmark. Not really cause for concern right now, but it could go either way. So just keep an eye on those students. They need some type of intervention, or they need urgent intervention. So the way this comes, you have this, you have some numbers like how many students, how many are in each category, what percentage, all of that. And then the identifying information that's been taken off of the handout is you would see a listing of students, which students fall into which categories. So the usage to a grade level team, and I'm just saying this as an example, it could be an academic department in a high school. It could even be school wide, depending on what you're doing. The first thing is just to know where are the kids at. It's not telling you skills necessarily. That's something we'll look at in the next slide. It's not telling you who's at grade level and who's not, because the benchmarks don't exactly correlate to grade level. It's just telling you kind of how we doing. You see here, I mean, depending on what side you consider on watch on, you see about half or maybe a little more to be at above, or I guess maybe you could say around the benchmark. Okay, so we're doing fairly well there. We do have some students that have some intervention needs. So one of the discussion points for the team members then would be, with that amount of students needing intervention, what do we want to do so they get that? Does this become centers in the classroom? Do we look for common areas of improvement and then do some stuff with everybody and then supplemental things for the students that need some more intervention? Is this part of an MTSS process and we need to refer these urgent intervention students to an RTI team for further evaluation? So all of those things would come from something like this. Some things to manage. And when I say manage, it's just if you're the team leader, something to be aware of, some things to consider, so that if you run into a couple sources of tension during the meeting, you know how to navigate that. You're prepared for it. So the first thing that I would suggest is just, we teachers, and I include myself in this as a teacher, sometimes teachers look at that listing and they see their kids lower down on the list, and they can kind of take it a little personally, like, well, I thought I did a better job, and well, that can't be true, and stuff like that. The test was too hard, whatever, different reaction. um so you want to make sure you're prepared if that reaction comes up, and again, emphasize some of those things, like, hey, this is just information about where they're at now. The important thing is, what are we going to do to help these students? Or another reaction might be, well, I know I taught it, or they got an A in my class. That's, I understand, but some of these skills still need work. So we're going to have to figure out how to do that. Just be prepared if that happens. Another thing, if you do get a really good test, there might be a natural human tendency to take that and say, okay, we did really good, let's move on. When we still should look at those areas of improvement, because unless 100% of kids are around that benchmark, there are going to be kids that are going to need some help, and they should get that help. Um, with that screening report, again, and this even, they have it from College Board for AP classes after the AP exam. It's a very common tool, the instructional planning report. What can we do with this data to help us plan instruction? Um, and these charts, by the way, I'm just using academic data sources. You can make them in some way for behavior, a little bit less so for engagement, but it's not only restricted to academic data. So this one, so you can see, is for a group of 166 students, 165 of whom have tested, and you can see summary data, scaled score, medians, low, high, percentiles, all of that. So the first thing again is what do we notice about this? The first thing I would say is it's a class that spans the full width of what you have for this assessment, right? We have students all the way at the top end. We have students all the way, unfortunately, at the low end. We see a median that's the 63rd percentile, which is pretty good. You would expect the median to be at about 50, so over 50 says good things about where these students are at. Usage to a grade level team. So the bottom part of this that I couldn't display on the slide, but you have in the handout, shows a listing of standards or objectives, or however you want to call them, that students in this group need to work on. So, I mean, that's a pretty big benefit to that grade level team, because they're going to know, okay, these are the skills these students need to work on. But you have some discussion points as well, because, like, we've seen it with STAR, especially near the end of the year, students in the ninth grade might get marked down on STAR math because they didn't get geometry questions correct, which they're in algebra 1. I'm just using this as an example. Most of those kids are in algebra. Of course they wouldn't get the geometry questions right. They haven't taken geometry yet. So that's a discussion point. Is this showing us something that we have taught and the students didn't get, so we need to go back and do like some remediation lessons on that? Is it something that we are currently working on, so they're going to go and improve on those skills just because they're currently in the process of learning them? Or is this something that they're going to see in the future, so we don't need to work on that right now because that's material that's coming up either this year or in a later year? So that way you can accurately plan what you're doing based on what's actually happening in your sequence of the course. For behavior data, this might look like, I mean, you can make instruction planning from behavior. What expectations are students maybe not meeting? Do we need to do some type of behavior lessons on, you know, lining up or going to a special or going to lunch or recess? Um, that might at first seem like something silly, like what do you mean we need to plan a behavior lesson? But if the data is showing that students, you have more problem behaviors when students are walking through the halls, going to lunch or music or whatever, it might help to reinforce, reteach those expectations to cut down on those problem behaviors, just as an example. The things to manage here, I would say it's kind of the same thing as the last one, like especially with those topics and standards, you might see more of the, well, I know this was taught, um, and or one of the other things you'll sometimes get is, well, they must have not tried, they must have not taken it seriously. Both of those are some common natural reactions if students score low. And what I would say to that, one of the most effective ways to handle something like that is just to ask a question. Okay, maybe they didn't try on that test. Take it seriously. What can we do to get a more accurate depiction of what they know? Or what strategies, maybe if it was a larger group of students that teachers feel maybe didn't take seriously what they were testing on. What can we do in the future to help them take the test more seriously, give us better data, and um, or like, if it's the, well, I know this, I taught this. Well, what do you think? Maybe were there kids that didn't understand it? Probably the same kids. They didn't do well on the chapter test. This probably showed the same thing. And then how can we get those kids? And I guess that would be the one thing, if you're having teachers react in a way that's like, I know I taught this, I know I did a better job than what this is showing. It's to validate that. Yes, I know that you did. I know that students learned it, but there were some that didn't, or didn't understand. And, how can we get them the help that they need? Um, Sometimes, this is, I think, again, just a human thing. If we validate people's efforts while still seeking that improvement and growth, it's going to go better than if we make data, these kids didn't score well enough and the teaching was bad. That's not going to be beneficial to anybody. And then where to go from here. One of the most important things about building a culture of data integration is going to be, what do you do with it? What is the plan going forward? Because you can have a lot of great conversations, but if there's not a concrete plan of what to do, then it makes it less likely that those conversations will lead to actual growth. So, what is the next step? Is it, like I said, is it specific lessons? Is it, let's meet again to talk about, how we're going to teach these upcoming concepts because the kids have low prior knowledge of it, whatever it might be. And then, set some dates, set a timeline, set a time to check in. So then the next thing that we have is the student version of this conversation. So when working with students, a lot of what you do is going to have to be based on the age of the student, right? You're going to be able to talk to a high schooler in more detailed terms than, a third grader. So just keep that part in mind. The first thing is making students comfortable. Um, again, students, especially when they're younger, they don't quite understand. They can't necessarily separate the, you know, what the test or assessment or whatever, or if you're talking to them about their behavior, is just information versus like it's good or bad or makes them good or bad or smart or not smart or whatever. Um, so making them comfortable is key. And one of the things with that is just, again, kind of going back to what I had said before, just making it part of the way things are in your class or in your school. If they get used to, like, I mean, this is a high school example, but what I would do every quiz, every test from the beginning of the year, okay, we took a test, we took a quiz, this is how we did. There's going to be, these questions went very well, these questions didn't. And we need to talk about them, and we talk about them so that we can improve, so that when those questions come up again, we get them right. And focusing on it like that, again, whatever that looks like for the age group you're working with, is going to work better than it being something mysterious, something that isn't really talked about, something that only comes up a couple times. It becomes like high stakes, because then it's going to make them nervous. They're going to maybe be a little afraid of it. Um, and then you're going to have a little bit more of a negative reaction. Um, the other thing, again, is about emphasizing information versus good and bad. The more that you can emphasize that it's whatever um, this is telling us, and then we have some things that we can do to grow, that's going to go a lot better than this is good, you did good, or you did bad. Because any kid who needs the most help, who didn't score as well, or who's having behavior challenges, um, the more they hear or associate themselves with the word bad, the less they're going to hear anything that you have to say. So we need to separate those as much as we can. Um, Emphasize that it doesn't determine who's smart. That's another thing. Again, your older students are going to be better able to say, you know what, I'm really good at English and I'm not so great at math. And that's just how things are. Um, Obviously, still room for growth. We still want to be successful, but they're better able to recognize like their talents and interests than a younger student. Um, so, this test is just telling us what it is and how you did. And it's going to tell you what you're good at and where you need to grow. It's not telling you that you're smart and another student is not, or vice versa. Um, have opportunities for them to view their own data. Again, the more open and transparent it is, the less threatening it will be. And I say that too about limited classroom data. Like, I mean, obviously, we're not doing the old school thing where everybody's grades get posted on the, you know, classroom window or something like that. That would not be good. But if they know, like, and I, like I said, I do this myself. If you tell them, all right, we need to go over number three. Only two people got number three right, so we really need to look at that one. That takes that stigma away from having gotten the question wrong, because, well, I think sometimes people's minds have a tendency to go to, I'm the only one that didn't get it. Everybody else got it right. I'm the only one that didn't get it. And then when they hear the teacher say that, everybody else got it wrong too, and it's like, oh, okay, I'm not, it's not so bad. Like, we all need to work on this. Maybe it was a bad question, whatever it was, versus, the alternative. So if they know that, and you got to be careful with that too, right? Like, on the flip side, if 24 out of 25 kids got number three right and you're the one kid that got it wrong, that's gonna If the teacher says only only one person got it wrong and you're the one, that's not going to be good either. So just use your judgment when sharing stuff like that. But um, especially in areas where a lot of students didn't do well, or there's a lot of maybe behavior challenges around, like coming back from recess or whatever it is, the more you can make the students who have struggles in that area feel like they're not alone, the more receptive they're going to be to whatever it is then that you're going to do to help them grow. And what you do with the data is essential to the culture around it with students. If it's just we're using this for growth, and we're or you need help with this concept, and I'm going to make sure you get it. Those things are going to go a long way. If we just take tests and put the results up on a shelf and then maybe talk about it, maybe not, then that's not going to go so well, and that's not going to be a positive culture around data. And certainly, and I know that nobody that's listening to this would do this, but I have to say it anyway. If you would be going, these are things are good and these are bad, and these students are smart and these students are not, um, and saying that to students, then you're going to have a negative culture around data. Again, I know nobody would do that. I'm just using it as a maybe a little bit more of an extreme example. Um, Most of these tests and assessments that you have do have a student report that go with them. This is an example of the STAR one. You can do this, you can do a lot of things with it. You can send it home physically via email, parts of it. You have a lot of freedom. That does require some use of judgment, though, and I'll go through that as maybe you can see from some of the things on here. Um, do you explain to students in a group and or one-on-one? Kind of depends on what's happening, and at how much you're sharing. If you look at this, so this obviously was taken at the end of the school year where the student had tested 3 times, and they ended up on watch at 28th percentile, low growth. They're in the grade 9, and their reading range is between 4th and 6th grade. In a situation like this, passing out a report that looks like this and telling the student to take it home or look at your own paper while I explain might not go so well. It might be better to go over that one-on-one so that you can kind of gauge the student's reaction, and intervene a little bit if they maybe start to spiral with what they're seeing. An alternative that you could do too is, um, it's what mindset do you want them to adopt? Growth mindset, right? We want to discourage them from looking at this and saying, well, this is bad, and disengaging. Um, or on the higher end, oh, I'm doing fine. I don't need to improve. Um, you want to get them engaging with growth. So how you present this is very important, whenever you're giving data to students. So maybe it would be good, like, and again, depends on the age group you're working with. If you're in an elementary school where they have library time, maybe you just share, it might be a little more work on the teacher side, like if you type up a little slip, of how, the reading range, these are the goals, you should be picking books in this range or a little bit higher than this, or whatever you would do, and that's the information you share at that point in time. So they don't see the low growth, or they don't see, um, the percentile rank, right? Or maybe you, again, when you download the reports, if you have the option to customize, that would be great. Maybe you just show them that chart, because the chart shows that this student is right around the benchmark. So that's, you're always room for growth, but you're in an okay place where you are right now. Just keep working hard, work on these areas. Um, that's going to maybe go a little bit better than telling a kid he's got low growth. That again probably wouldn't go over too well. Um, the other thing that's on the handout you'll see that comes below this is a listing of topics. I forget what they're called now, like learning areas or learning priorities or something like that. Um, Same thing with that. You have to use your judgment to gauge how much of this should I share with the student. Is this something that they can handle and realistically do something about, or is this something that I, as the teacher, need to manage with and for them? If you're telling a student, okay, you have all these areas to improve on, um, especially if the student, like if you have students that are working with outside tutors or something, that might be a different call because you can provide this to the parent who provides it to the tutor, versus if you have students that don't, maybe you just look at, okay, this is what these kids have to work on. This kid needs this kid needs that, this kid needs the other, and then that works into your planning. If you feel like distributing that information could have maybe more of an adverse reaction. Um, just as an aside, this is more venturing into the school leadership realm here, but like with this instructional reading level, if you have something, my mom used to do this when she was a librarian, if they have like stickers on the books or like they're or on the shelves or whatever, books in these grade ranges are green or blue or purple or whatever it is. So maybe the kid knows he should be taking books with a purple sticker. He doesn't necessarily know that that's a fourth grade reading level book and he's in the seventh grade or something like that. So, um, just an idea of maybe how to, for lack of a better word, camouflage some things so that the student is getting what they need, but then not necessarily having a stigma attached to it because they know that they're in the seventh grade reading a fourth grade book. Just an example. And then again, it's always important to think, where do we go from here? If you're sharing this information with students, especially if they have a little bit more to work on, telling them what you're going to do to help them and with them and how you're going to support them is very important. So if you're sitting down with this student and she's struggling with math, we're going, okay, I know you're struggling with math, so we're going to work on this. Or when we have centers, you're going to do these things. Or I know you really don't like fractions, but you got to work on them, so I want you to do this particular practice or activity. So having a plan that can kind of blunt some of that. If there's a lot that they need to work on, we're going to focus on these things. And so it can make it feel less overwhelming to a student. Then the last thing I want to talk about is just with families. So when you have data integration with families, I mean, parents, they have a right to know how their students are doing. But again, we have to present that in a way they're going to receive and that they're going to be able to understand and that they're going to be able to do something with. We have to understand that most parents don't understand educational data in the way we do. Um, a lot of the data that, even if we have parents that work as data analysts and stuff like that, like some things are universal to any kind of working with data, right? Mean, median, mode, that kind of stuff, average, um, whatever, average grade. Those words mean the same thing in any context. Um, But then when we start talking about learning objectives and zone of proximal development and instructional reading level and those kinds of terms, unless the families and parents, unless they're trained educators as well, those words don't mean a whole lot. If you walk up to a parent, random parent on the street and tell them, or ask them, do you know what your student's zone of proximal development is? A lot of people are going to look at you like, what are you talking about? So we have to do things with our families to build data literacy specifically around education. In the same way that we have to teach academic language to our students for the subjects that we teach, it's our job if we're sharing data to be able to communicate to families what they're looking at accurately. Sometimes, and I'll show you an example of this in a second, sometimes the platforms you use may have different things to help with that, like a family resource or something along those lines. But it might be as simple as you putting together a data glossary and distributing that to families. So, when you see this, this is what it means. Um, Again, always have to be ready. Some parents may take how the student's doing personally as like, you're telling me I'm a bad parent. Um, and the more we can emphasize this is just information and it tells us how to best support the students, the more you can kind of mitigate some of those reactions, especially if you preface it with, in the class this year, we're going to be looking at, XYZ assessments, and that's going to generate some data that tells us how students are doing and how we can best support them. If you start the year with that and keep returning to that idea, it's going to help parents to maybe view data in a different way. Unfortunately, some parents may question those data measures or even, the teaching. They may have questions about the assessment and how it works. So, again, and then again, this is more for school leadership. Make sure you have that information available to teachers so that they can communicate it to parents, or communicate if it's a school-wide thing, communicate it to parents directly. This is what this test does. This is how it's measured. You can read more here if you like, so that parents know it's, an actual vetted instrument. You may have parents, what do you mean he can't add numbers? Did you teach it? Um, and having, again, that being able to have that difficult conversation of, yes, we did go over this in class, but, um, you know, obviously there are some struggles here, and so we're going to do these things to help the student grow. Again, as long as they feel like you're trying to support the student's mastery, it's going to be different than if they feel like you're telling them the student isn't smart, or something like that. Information and growth, not judgment. We're not saying anybody's good or bad or smart or not smart. We're talking about what student mastery looks like and how we can get all students there. And being open and transparent. One of the things that's very helpful, if you're looking at different things, is to tell them ahead of time, even if it's a classroom test. We have the chapter 1 test next week. We are taking STAR testing next month. As they know it's coming up, they know when they can expect the results, they know what's being measured. All of those things help. Same thing with behavior. It's better to be open and transparent about what's happening in the class if the issue is small than to wait for parent-teacher conferences and when it becomes a big thing, or when we're having to call the parent in for a meeting with the principal or something like that. A lot of these things, again, have family reports. So this is an example of a STAR family report. So they give a little bit, and honestly, to be completely honest, I almost prefer to use this report with students rather than the actual student report. It's more visual, it includes more explanation. So I like this better. So, and you have that freedom when you're communicating with families and with students. Like, what's the best thing that I have available to me to communicate what I want to communicate? Doesn't matter if you're giving the student the family report or the parents the student report. If that's what's going to communicate it best, then that's what you should do. But think about, like, what explanation is needed if you're sending this home. Do you send that with the report? Do you send it in advance? Like I said before, with terms, do you need to include an explanation of unfamiliar terms that they might be seeing for the first time? Um, Something maybe it'd be better at, with something I like, is to use this at a parent-teacher conference where you can sit down and actually discuss it in person versus, or over Zoom or whatever, versus just mailing it home. This one, if you look on the handout, also includes the same thing at the bottom of the student reports about like skills to work on. So it's the same thing, like, do you want to share that? Do you not? Do you think that's better shared in a different way? Completely up to you. And just make sure you present it in a positive way, emphasizing growth. Even if the student didn't score so well, even if they're in urgent intervention, if you tell the parent, obviously some things didn't go so well here, but we're here to help. I'm going to work with you. We have these supports available for your student. That's going to go much better than, hey, your kid scored urgent intervention. Here we go. Please take this home and sign it or something like that. It's not That's not the best way to present things. And that statement really applies to everything. Um, Even if the data shows something that's not the best, presenting it in a positive way with a growth mindset focused on improvement and how we are going to support students is 90% of what students and families and even our colleagues need to hear and to be thinking about. That's the end of the presentation. Thanks for watching. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions.